How many times does a story have to be told before someone truly listens? For my daughter Alara, the answer is written in crayon, stacked in teetering towers that fill every corner of her small bedroom. She sits there now, a ghost in her own home, her small shoulders hunched over the little wooden desk, her hand moving with a steady, practiced rhythm. The squeak and scrape of wax on paper is the only sound she has made in 6 months. On the page, the same image blooms again. A 4-paned window, always rendered in a shaky but determined brown outline. A jagged crack, a lightning bolt of black, splintering the top left square. And outside, perched on the sill, a small dark bird, its head cocked at an unnerving angle. It's always the same, the number of panes, the location of the crack, the tilt of the bird's head, always. Dr. Albright calls it perseveration. He used the word last Tuesday, his office smelling of coffee and disinfectant, his face a mask of clinical pity. It's a coping mechanism, Sarah, he'd said, steepling his fingers. A repetitive, non-communicative one. Her mind is caught in a loop, replaying a fragment. The drawings are a symptom of the trauma, not a description of it. He called them repetitive, a dismissal that felt like a slap. To him, my daughter's tireless work was meaningless, the mental equivalent of a skipping record. But I see it differently. I sit on the edge of her bed, watching her select a black crayon, and I don't see a loop. I see insistence. This isn't a mindless tick, it's the only voice she has left. Alara hasn't spoken a single word since the day the search party found her, shivering and silent near the old quarry road. Her coat was torn, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it had swallowed her voice whole. The doctor said the shock had locked it away, so I watch her draw, and I defend it with every fiber of my being, because I believe she is not just drawing, she is testifying. She's not stuck, doctor. She's pointing. The police closed the file weeks ago, labeling it misadventure. A 10-year-old girl gets lost in the woods, scares herself, and goes non-verbal. Case closed. But the questions they couldn't answer still haunt my nights. Where was she for those 8 hours? How did her coat get torn? Only one officer, a Detective Harding with tired eyes and a rumpled suit, seemed to share the knot of unease in my stomach. Kids get turned around, he'd told me, his gaze lingering on the woods behind our house. But this feels different. With no evidence, his hands were tied. Now, as Alara finishes her 100th rendition of that window, a cold dread I haven't felt in months creeps up my spine. I've always assumed she was drawing a memory, a window from wherever she was held. But as I look at the dark shape of the bird, so stark against the white paper, a new, terrifying thought takes root. What if it's not a memory? What if it's a map? A map. The word echoed in the silent space between my heartbeats. It wasn't a map to a treasure, but a warning, a landmark. I scrambled off her bed, my movements clumsy, and gathered a handful of the drawings from a stack by the door. I spread them on the hallway floor under the harsh glare of the overhead light. One after another, 100 identical windows, 100 identical cracks, 100 identical birds. Dr. Albright saw repetition. I now saw a single, unwavering message screamed in crayon. The bird. Its head was always cocked, its black bead eye seemingly fixed on the viewer. But it wasn't looking at Alara, it was looking out of the drawing. It was a watcher, a sentinel. The chilling realization washed over me, cold and absolute. Alara wasn't drawing a place she had been. She was drawing a place she could see, right now. The vulnerable person in this story, the only thing that mattered, was my daughter. And she wasn't just trapped in a memory, she was trapped in a cage of silence, trying to warn me that the wolf was still at the door. The man who had taken her, who had stolen her voice, wasn't a phantom from the past. He was close, he was watching, and this window, this bird, they were his sigil. My breath hitched. The case was closed. The doctors were patting my hand and prescribing time. No one was looking. No one but Alara. And now me. I wouldn't let her be a ghost anymore. I wouldn't let them dismiss her testimony. My fear, which had been a suffocating blanket for 6 months, was finally burning away, leaving a core of pure, hot rage. I was done waiting. I was done hoping. I was going to make them listen. Before I go on, before I tell you what I did next, what that one desperate act set in motion, if you're finding your way to this story, if you believe a little girl's voice deserves to be heard no matter how she speaks, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means more than you know. It means Alara's story won't be lost. I dug through the junk drawer in the kitchen, my hands shaking so badly I could barely sort through the old takeout menus and rubber bands. And then I found it, a worn business card. Detective R. Harding. I took a deep, shuddering breath and dialed the number, my thumb hovering over the call button. I was about to call a man who hadn't spoken to me in months, to tell him that my traumatized daughter's crayon drawings were a map to a predator who might be watching our house. I was going going to sound insane. I didn't care. He answered on the third ring, his voice gravelly with exhaustion. Harding, detective, it's Sarah Miller. Laura's mother. There was a pause. I could picture him perfectly, rubbing the fatigue from his eyes. Mrs. Miller, is everything all right? No, it's not, I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. It's the drawings. I was wrong. We were all wrong. They're not a memory, it's a warning. You said it felt different. You said you felt it. You have to come look. Please, you were the only one who listened. I stopped, forcing myself to breathe. The silence on the other end of the line was terrifying. Then he sighed. It wasn't a sigh of dismissal, but of deep, bone-weary resignation. Where are you, Sarah? I'm at home. I have them all. I have hundreds. Another pause. I'll be there in 30 minutes. The 30 minutes before Harding was due to arrive stretched into an eternity. I spent them in a state of frantic, focused activity. I left the drawings spread on the hallway floor, a crayon-scrawled path of breadcrumbs leading from the front door. Then I went to Alara's room. She hadn't moved, her small back still a question mark against the dim light of her desk lamp. The only change was the crayon in her hand. She was shading the bird now, pressing down with a force that threatened to tear the paper. I knelt behind her and gently squeezed her shoulders. She didn't flinch, didn't look up. He's coming, sweet girl, I whispered, my voice thick. Detective Harding. He's coming to look at your pictures. He's going to listen this time. There was no response, only the steady scrape, scrape of wax. I backed out of the room, pulling the door almost completely shut, leaving only a small crack. I didn't want her to see the police car when it arrived. I didn't want anything to break her concentration. She was testifying, and the court was about to be in session. I paced the length of the hallway, my bare feet cold on the hardwood, my eyes darting from the drawings to the front door and back again. The house was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant, muffled sound of Alara's work. It was a silence I had grown to hate, a heavy, suffocating thing. Tonight it felt different. It felt charged, like the air before a lightning strike. He was watching. I knew it in my bones. Every creak of the old house was his footstep. Every shadow in the corner of my eye was his form. Then I heard it, a soft, distinct thump against glass. It wasn't loud. It was the sound a large moth might make or a bird misjudging its flight path, but it came from the back of the house, from the kitchen window that overlooked the darkest, most overgrown part of our yard, bordering the woods. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen in the hallway, straining my ears. Nothing. Just the hum, just the scraping. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic prisoner. I forced my legs to move, creeping towards the kitchen. The linoleum was cool under my feet. The window above the sink was a black rectangle, reflecting the dim light of the hallway behind me. I saw nothing outside. My own wide-eyed, terrified face stared back at me. I reached out a trembling hand and flipped the switch for the back porch light. The yellow glare flooded the small, weathered deck, and my breath left my body in a choked, silent scream. There on the wooden railing, placed directly in the center of the middle pane, was a bird, a small, dark starling. It wasn't perched. It was lying on its side. Its neck had been snapped, its head twisted back at an impossible, grotesque angle, the exact angle. The precise, unnerving tilt from 100 of Alara's drawings. Its tiny, black bead eye was dull, but it seemed to stare right at me, a void of mocking knowledge. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't an accident. This was a signature. A response. He knew I had called the police. He knew I was looking. He had taken Alara's private silent scream and thrown it back in my face. I see you, I hear you, and I can get this close whenever I want. The fear I'd felt before was a pale, watery thing compared to the tidal wave that crashed over me now. But something else rose with it, something black and hot and vicious. The rage, it burned away the terror, cauterizing the wound. I was no longer a victim cowering in her house. I was a mother whose child was being hunted. He had crossed a line. He had come to my home. He had brought his violence to my door. There was no going back. There was no more hoping, no more waiting for doctors to find a cure or for time to heal. This was a war, and he had just made his opening move. I didn't touch the bird. I didn't scream. I backed away from the window, my movements slow and deliberate. I walked to the front door, unlocked it, and stood on the threshold, staring into the darkness of the street. Let him watch. Let him see me waiting. Because in the distance I could finally see them. Two beams of light heading through the night, turning onto our street. Harding was here, and I had my evidence. I didn't move from the doorway, my body a statue of grim welcome. The headlights washed over me, pinning me in a stark white glare before the engine cut. Harding unfolded himself from the unmarked sedan, his suit even more rumpled in person, his face a road map of exhaustion under the porch light. He saw me standing there, and his professional gait faltered for just a second. "Sarah," he said, his voice low as he approached the steps. "Let's go inside." No, I said, my own voice surprisingly steady. Not yet, around back. There's something you need to see first. Without waiting for a reply, I led him off the porch and onto the damp grass. My bare feet didn't register the cold. I walked him to the edge of the small deck, my fingers shaking as I pointed. There. Harding followed my gaze. He was silent for a long moment, his shoulders tensing. He wasn't looking at it like a homeowner might see a sad random bit of nature. He was looking at it like a cop looks at a body. He took out his phone, its screen casting a blue, clinical light on the scene, and snapped a few pictures. When? He asked, his voice all business. Just before you got here. I heard a thump against the kitchen window. You saw who did it? No, just this. He nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the dead bird. This is what you meant on the phone. The warning. It's the signature, I said, tugging him by the sleeve, pulling him back towards the front of the house. Now you can come inside. The sight of the drawings carpeting the hallway floor stopped him cold. He stood in the entryway, his gaze sweeping over the crayon-scrawled landscape. He crouched down, his knees cracking, and picked one up, holding it delicately as if it were fragile evidence. He compared it to the photo on his phone. The angle of the head, he murmured more to himself than to me. It's exact. He looked up at me, and for a fleeting, beautiful second, I felt a surge of pure relief. He saw it. He finally saw it. But then the weariness returned to his eyes, settling deeper into the lines around them. He stood up, placing the drawing carefully back on the floor. He walked the length of the hall, his shoes making soft sounds on the paper, his expression hardening with every step. I believe you, Sarah, he said, turning to face me. The relief I'd felt curdled in my stomach. I knew what was coming next. It was in his tone, the but. I believe this is a message. It's deliberate, it's sick, and it's meant to terrorize you. But what do you want me to do? The question was so absurd, so utterly defeating, that I could only stare at him. What do I want you to find him. He was here. He was in my yard minutes ago. He's taunting me. He's threatening my daughter. With what evidence? He countered, his voice gentle but firm. The voice of a man who has delivered bad news 1,000 times. Sarah, I walk into my captain's office tomorrow and I tell him that I want a task force because someone left a dead bird on your porch. They'll say it was a sick prank by some local kids. I show them these drawings and they'll show me Dr. Albright's report on perseveration. I have no weapon, no fingerprints, no suspect. Legally, my hands are tied. There is no crime here other than maybe trespassing, and we can't prove that. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. All the hot rage, the certainty, it all cooled into a familiar, sickening dread. So that's it. We do nothing. We wait for him to do something else. We wait until he gets to Alara again. I'll file a report, he said, the words tasting like ash in the air. I'll request extra patrols in the area. I'll look at the file again, see if there are any known offenders with this kind of theatrical MO, but officially there's nothing to go on. I'm sorry, he was sorry. The doctor was sorry. The whole world was sorry. But no one was doing anything. I watched as he collected his things, gave me another look of useless pity, and walked out the door. I locked it behind him. The click of the bolt echoing in the enormous silence of the house. The system hadn't just failed me. It had looked me in the eye, acknowledged my terror, and then politely excused itself. I stood in the hallway surrounded by my daughter's silent screams, and I knew no one was coming to help. The police weren't coming. The doctors weren't coming. I was on my own. It was just me, the watcher in the woods, and the little girl in the next room, drawing the map to a war only I could fight. After the click of the lock, the silence in the house rushed back in, heavier than before. It was no longer an empty silence. It was a listening one. I stood there for a long time, the paper faces of 100 identical birds staring up at me from the floor. Harding's pity, his professional resignation, it was just another locked door. Another person telling me to wait, to be patient, while the wolf circled my house. My rage had cooled, leaving something harder and colder in its place. A decision. I knelt, my knees protesting, and began to gather the drawings. I didn't stack them haphazardly this time. I collected them with a strange sort of reverence, straightening their corners, ordering them into a neat, solid block of testimony. This wasn't the scattered mess of a sick child's obsession. It was a dossier. It was my only ammunition. I took the stack into my bedroom, not Alara's, and placed it on my nightstand. I couldn't bear to be separated from it now. I checked on Alara, who had finally fallen asleep at her desk, her head pillowed on her arms, surrounded by crayon shavings. Her small chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm that belied the storm inside her. I gently lifted her, her body limp and light, and tucked her into bed. As I pulled the covers up to her chin, my gaze fell on her window. The 4 dark panes looked out into the blackness of the woods. For a moment, I imagined a face looking back. I drew the curtains with a sharp tug, plunging the room into darkness. Sleep didn't come. I lay in my own bed, eyes wide open, tracing the shadows on the ceiling. Every creak of the house settling was his footstep on the porch. Every rustle of leaves outside was him, hiding in the bushes, watching. The dead bird on the railing wasn't just a message. It was a promise. The night was a long, slow torture of listening. When the first pale light of dawn finally filtered through my blinds, I rose, feeling hollowed out and ancient. I went to Alara's room to wake her, my body moving on autopilot. I pushed her door open gently. The morning sun, weak as it was, cut through the gap in the curtains I'd left, illuminating a stream of dust motes. And then it hit it. The window. My blood turned to ice. There, on the top left pane of glass, was a crack. It was not a spiderweb fracture from a stray pebble. It was a single jagged line, a miniature lightning bolt that split the pane almost exactly in half. It was sharp, it was new, and it was a perfect, horrifying replica of the crack in Alara's drawings. My breath caught in my throat, a painful scraping thing. I walked towards it as if in a trance, my fingertips rising to touch the cold, violated glass. He had been here. While we slept, he had stood on the lawn below, just feet from my daughter, and he had taken a tool, a piece of stone, something, and carefully, deliberately carved his signature into our home, into her room. The message was brutally clear. I am not just a memory. I am not just in the woods. I can come to your window. I can touch your house. I can finish what I started. I backed away, a low sound of pure animal fury building in my chest. I looked at Alara, still sleeping, so peaceful, so unaware of how close he had come. The system had failed. The walls of my home had failed. I was the only thing left standing between my daughter and the monster who was trying to reclaim her. I snatched my phone from my pocket, my fingers stabbing at the screen. I found Harding's number. This was not the pleading, half-hysterical call from before. My hand was steady. My voice, when I spoke, was as cold and sharp as the new crack in the glass. He answered on the second ring. Harding, he was here, I said. No greeting, no introduction. At her window, he cracked the glass. It's the same crack, detective, from the drawings. You wanted evidence you could bring to your captain? You have it now. Get over here. There was no pause on the line this time, no weary sigh, just the clipped, urgent sound of his voice. Don't touch anything. I'm 5 minutes out. The 5 minutes felt like 5 seconds. I was still standing by Alara's window, my hand hovering near the violent new scar on the glass, when his car screeched to a halt in the driveway. He didn't bother with the porch steps, vaulting over the railing and meeting me at the back of the house where I stood pointing. He saw the crack. His face, illuminated by the cold blue light of his phone as he documented the damage, was a mask of controlled fury. The professional weariness was gone, replaced by the sharp, dangerous focus of a hunter who has found a fresh track. He used a glass cutter, Harding said, his voice a low growl. Scored it and tapped it. Quiet, deliberate. He followed me inside. He didn't need me to point out the drawings this time. He walked straight to them, kneeling in the center of the paper-strewn hallway. He picked one up, then another, his eyes darting between the crayon image and the photo of the cracked window on his phone. This is it, he said, the 2 words of vow. This is what I needed. Malicious destruction of property, stalking, terroristic threats. I can get a warrant. We can put a camera on the house, on the whole street. A warrant? The word was a splash of cold water. He was here, Harding. He was at her window. We can't wait for paperwork and cameras. He's escalating. It's the only way, Sarah. I can't just go kicking in doors based on a drawing. He gestured around at the 100 paper windows. This is his place. The place he took her. We know that now. But where is it? A 4-paned window could be anywhere. My hope, which had flared so brightly, began to sputter. He was right. We had the what, but not the where. I sank to my knees opposite him, surrounded by the evidence of my daughter's torment. My eyes scanned the familiar images, the shaky brown lines, the black gash, the dark bird. I'd looked at them a million times, but I had never looked at them with the image of the dead starling and the freshly cracked glass burning in my mind. Wait, I whispered, my own voice sounding distant. I snatched one of the drawings from the floor, holding it close to my face. We've been looking at it wrong. I said it was a map, but we've been reading it like a symbol. It's literal. What do you mean, the brown? I said, my finger tracing the outline of the window. Look, it's not the flat, solid brown of painted wood. Alara used 2 different crayons, a light brown and a dark one. It's mottled, streaked, and the lines, they aren't straight. They're bowed, dented. My breath hitched. It's not wood, detective. It's rust. Harding went utterly still. His eyes, fixed on the drawing in my hand, lost their focus for a second, looking inward. I could almost see the gears turning, the mental map of the county spinning under his tired brow. The quarry road, the woods, the torn coat. The old consolidated quarry, he said, his voice barely a whisper. They shut it down in the 90s. The search party swept the main road, but the back half of the property is a graveyard of junked equipment. They left it all to rot. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a sudden, terrible understanding. There's an old rock crusher, bigger than a house. On the side of it, there's a control booth, a little metal box on stilts. My heart stopped. A little metal box. A cage. Without another word, we were moving. There was no more talk of warrants or procedure. There was only the silent, shared certainty. He grabbed his jacket, and I grabbed my keys, my mind a blank slate of pure forward motion. We drove in his unmarked car, tearing through the quiet pre-dawn streets. He didn't use his sirens. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and my own ragged breathing. He turned off the main road onto a pitted gravel track I recognized with a lurch of my stomach. The quarry road. We bumped along for another half-mile, deeper into the woods, until he pulled the car to a stop behind a thicket of overgrown pine trees. "We walk from here," he said, cutting the engine. He led the way, his hand resting on the holstered gun at his hip. We pushed through tangled undergrowth, the air growing cold and damp, smelling of wet earth and decay, and then the trees opened up. Before us lay a field of skeletal, rusting machinery. Hulking, silent shapes loomed like prehistoric beasts in the gloom, and there, perched precariously on a collapsing gantry, was a small, rusted orange box. It had a single window on its face, a window divided into 4 squares by corroded metal bars. The top left pane of glass was shattered, a jagged black crack splitting it in two. It was real, my daughter's crayon nightmare, rendered in 3 dimensions of rust and decay. For 180 days I had stared at that image, and now I was standing inside it. My legs gave out, and I sank to the damp ground, my hands covering my mouth to stifle a sob that was half terror, half vindication. It was a map she had been pointing all along. "Stay here," Harding commanded, his voice a low, urgent whisper. He didn't look back. His gun was in his hand now, held low against his leg as he began to move forward, a dark shape detaching itself from the trees. He moved with a fluid, predatory grace I hadn't seen in him before. The rumpled detective was gone. This was the hunter. He reached the corroded metal staircase that led up to the control booth and placed a foot on the first step. It groaned in protest. He froze, listening. The world was silent, save for the drip of water from a piece of rusted machinery and the frantic thumping of my own heart. He took another step, then another, until he was on the small platform outside the door. He reached for the handle, and the door swung open. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, framed by a weak yellow light from within. He was of average height, average build, his face obscured by the gloom. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a piece of paper. "I was wondering when she'd get it right," the man said. His voice was calm, conversational, and it was the most horrifying sound I had ever heard. The tilt of the head was always the hardest part for me, too. Harding's gun was up in an instant, a solid black line connecting him to the figure. "Police? Hands where I can see them. Step out now." The man didn't seem startled. He dropped the paper, which fluttered down to the metal platform, and slowly raised his hands. He stepped out of the booth and into the weak morning light. He was nobody. A man in his 40s with thinning hair and a plain gray jacket. He could have been my neighbor. He could have been in line behind me at the grocery store. The sheer, terrifying banality of his face made my stomach turn. He looked past Harding, his eyes finding me where I knelt on the ground. There was no malice in his expression. There was something far worse. Recognition. A sense of shared understanding. "You're her mother," he said, as if stating a simple fact. "She's a watcher, just like me. I saw it in her the first time," he gestured with his head back towards the booth. "This is my place. I come here to watch the woods, to see things nobody else sees. I thought she would appreciate it. A quiet place to see." The confession wasn't shouted. It was offered, a quiet explanation between 2 people who he believed were peers. The horror of it washed over me. He hadn't just stolen her. He believed he had given her a gift. He had taken her to his sanctuary, this rusted metal box, and forced her to share his obsession. The window wasn't a prison bar, it was his lens. The bird wasn't a random detail, it was his sigil, a fellow watcher. "Why?" I screamed, the word tearing from my throat, raw and broken. "Why her?" The man's gaze flickered, a brief flash of irritation crossing his plain features. "She wasn't listening. I tried to show her. I sat her right there, gave her paper, crayons. I showed her how to draw the window, how to see it properly. But all she did was cry. He looked at Harding, then back at me, a shrug of profound disappointment. So I took her home, but I kept watching. I thought maybe she'd finally understand. The drawings, they were her way of talking to me. I knew it. And the bird on your porch, the crack in her window, that was me talking back. The world narrowed to that single monstrous revelation. The drawings weren't a map for me. They were a conversation with him. Alara hadn't just been testifying. She had been forced into a dialogue with her tormentor, a dialogue I had finally, accidentally, intercepted. Harding began shouting commands, cuffing the man, reading him his rights, but the sounds were distant, muffled. All I could see was the drawing the man had dropped, lying face up on the platform. It was a four-paned window, rendered in charcoal. A jagged crack splintered the top left square, and perched on the sill, its head cocked at a familiar, unnerving angle, was a small dark bird. It was perfect. The world dissolved into a smear of gray light and rusted metal. The man's words echoed in the hollow space where my heart had been, looping and replaying like one of Dr. Albright's skipping records. She's a watcher, just like me. He hadn't hurt her in the way I'd feared. He'd done something worse. He had tried to remake her in his own twisted image, to colonize her mind with his sickness. The torn coat, the 8 hours of terror. It wasn't a botched kidnapping. It was a failed lesson, a failed indoctrination. The drawings weren't her screaming for help. They were homework she was forced to complete, a dialogue of terror she maintained because she thought it would keep him away. My body began to shake, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that started in my hands and spread through my entire frame. The cold of the damp earth seeped into my bones. Harding's voice, sharp and authoritative, was a background noise, like a television playing in another room. All I could see was that charcoal drawing on the rusted platform. His drawing. It was a mirror image of Alara's, but where hers were shaky and frantic, his was confident, precise. He was the teacher, she was the student. My daughter's trauma wasn't a symptom, it was a curriculum. A wave of nausea so profound it buckled me forward, and I retched onto the dead leaves, my body finally expelling the poison of the last 6 months. Distant sirens grew into a piercing wail, and soon the clearing was bathed in the strobe of red and blue lights. Uniformed officers swarmed the area, their movements efficient and impersonal. They were taping off the scene, their boots crunching on the gravel, their voices a low murmur of official business. An officer, a young woman with a kind but serious face, approached me with a blanket. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I couldn't speak. I could only point a trembling finger towards Harding, who was now leading the cuffed man, this bland, monstrous nobody, towards a marked car. Harding saw me and walked over, his expression a mixture of grim satisfaction and deep concern. "Sarah," he said, his voice soft. He knelt in front of me. "We got him. It's over. The drawings," I managed to choke out, my voice a raw whisper. "In my car, you need them." He nodded, understanding completely. "I know." He turned to the female officer. "Get the box from Mrs. Miller's front seat. Handle it as evidence, every single one." She left, and Harding stayed with me. I watched as other officers carefully bagged the charcoal drawing from the platform. I watched as they photographed the rusted booth, the broken window, the corroded stairs. They were seeing it now. The whole world was finally seeing it. The system that had dismissed me, that had patted my hand and offered pity, was now meticulously gathering the very evidence it had once refused to see. My stack of 100 crayon drawings wasn't the ramblings of a traumatized child anymore. It was the key. It was the entire case. I didn't have to fight them. I didn't have to scream. All I had to do was let them work. I had carried my daughter's story through the darkness, and now, finally, I could hand it over into the light. I don't remember getting to my feet. I think Harding helped me. The blanket the young officer had draped over my shoulders felt impossibly heavy, woven from all the pity I had been shown over the last 6 months. But this was different. This wasn't the clinical pity of Dr. Albright. It was the shared, human shock of bearing witness to something awful. The world had finally caught up to my nightmare. The female officer returned from my car carrying the cardboard box that held Alara's drawings. She held it with a forensic care that made my stomach clench. I had gathered those pages with such defiant pride, seeing them as my daughter's voice, her weapon. Now, seeing them in the officer's gloved hands, I felt a wave of revulsion. They weren't Alara's voice. They were his. They were the echoes of his commands, the proof of his curriculum. Each crayon stroke was a mark of her compliance, a desperate attempt to answer him correctly so he would leave her alone. The window, the crack, the bird, they were a catechism of terror he had forced into her head. My evidence was her chains. "We'll take care of these, Sarah," Harding said, his hand on my arm guiding me toward his sedan. "They'll be the core of the prosecution." The prosecution. The legal system I had cursed was now my only recourse. But what court could prosecute the true crime? They could lock him away for stalking, for breaking the window, for what he did to that bird. But how could they sentence him for what he had tried to steal from my daughter? He saw a watcher, a kindred spirit. In her wide, terrified eyes, he saw a reflection of his own obsessive solitude. That was the deepest violation. Not that he had taken her, but that he thought he knew her. As we drove away from the quarry, leaving the flashing lights and official procedures behind, a new kind of fear began to bloom in the silence of the car. The specific threat of the watcher in the woods was gone, but he had left behind a more insidious phantom. Now, every window I saw in the passing houses looked like an eye. Every person walking their dog in the early morning light seemed to have a secret life. The man's terrifying ordinariness had fractured my world. The monster wasn't a grotesque creature from a fairy tale. He was the man with thinning hair who might bag your groceries. He was everywhere. When Harding pulled up to my house, the sun was fully up, casting long shadows across the lawn. The crack was still in Alara's window, a thin, dark scar in the morning light. It was no longer a clue. It was a wound on my home. I thanked Harding, my voice a stranger's, and walked to my front door. My hand hesitated on the knob. The fight to get someone to listen was over. Now, a different, quieter, and more terrifying battle was about to begin. I had to walk into that house and face my daughter. I had to look at her, sleeping peacefully in her bed, and know that her silence might not be a lockbox of fear. It might be an empty room, a quiet place he had tried to furnish with his own madness, and I had no idea if she would ever be able to throw it all out. 2 days later, I sat in the waiting room of Dr. Albright's office. The air carried the same sterile scent of coffee and disinfectant, but it no longer intimidated me. It smelled like a mistake. I wasn't there for a consultation. I was there for a reckoning. Beside me, Detective Harding sat in one of the 2 small chairs, his presence a quiet, solid weight. He wasn't in his rumpled suit. He wore his formal uniform, the crisp blue a stark contrast to the bland beige of the office. He was not here as a friend. He was here as an officer of the court. When Albright's door opened, his face bore the familiar mask of clinical pity. It faltered when he saw Harding. "Mrs. Miller, detective, is there a problem? We're here to discuss a misdiagnosis, doctor," I said, my voice as cold and flat as a slab of steel. I walked past him into his office and placed a thin file on the polished surface of his desk. He remained in the doorway, confused. Harding followed me in and closed the door behind him. "You might want to sit down," he advised. Dr. Albright moved to his chair, his eyes darting between me and the file. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On one side was a photo of Alara's bedroom window, the jagged crack a perfect lightning bolt. On the other was a photo of the rusted control booth at the quarry. In the center, I had placed one of Alara's drawings. "Perseveration," I said, tapping the drawing. "A repetitive, non-communicative loop, the mental equivalent of a skipping record. Those were your words." Albright looked at the photos, his professional composure beginning to crack. I don't understand. His name is Arthur Dean," Harding said, his voice devoid of emotion. "For 6 months he stalked this family. The drawings weren't a loop, doctor. They were a conversation. He was teaching her, correcting her, forcing her to replicate his sigil. The dead bird on the porch was a message. The crack in her window was him marking her room. Your report, which concluded she was non-communicative, was used by my department to justify closing the case. Your diagnosis didn't just dismiss her. It actively endangered her by convincing everyone she had nothing to say." Albright's face went pale. He picked up the paper, his hands shaking slightly. He looked from the drawing to the photos, the confident certainty draining from his eyes, replaced by a dawning horror. "I had no way of knowing. You had 100 chances to know." I slammed my hand on his desk, the sound making him jump. "You had 100 drawings and a mother telling you her child was pointing at something, and you chose the simplest, most dismissive answer. You saw a symptom, not a witness." I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a whisper. "This ends now. You will amend Alara's file. You will strike the word perseveration. You will strike non-communicative. You will state in your professional capacity that her repetitive artistic expression was a direct, coerced communication related to her abduction and subsequent stalking. You will state that she was the sole consistent witness. Her story, the real one, will be the only one in her official record. Am I clear?" Harding added. "Your original report will be entered as evidence in Mr. Dean's trial, doctor. I imagine the prosecution will have several questions about it. A formal addendum, correcting the record based on new evidence, would reflect well on your willingness to cooperate." The threat, veiled but potent, hung in the air. Albright stared at the paper in his hands, at the proof of his failure. He looked up at me, the clinical pity gone, replaced by the hollow gaze of a man whose entire framework had just been dismantled. He nodded, a single jerky motion. "Yes," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'll amend the file." 2 months later, the autumn air had scoured the last of the summer's oppressive humidity from the sky. The woods behind the house were a blaze of gold and crimson, and the world no longer felt like it was holding its breath. Our weekly sessions were not with Dr. Albright, but with a woman named Anya, whose office smelled of sandalwood and linseed oil. She never called Alara's art perseveration. She called it a language, and she was teaching me how to become fluent. We didn't talk much. Mostly, we sat together on the floor with a large roll of paper between us, and we drew. Anya drew swirling abstract shapes. I drew houses with strong doors. Alara, for weeks, drew nothing at all. The legal system, once a monolith of indifference, was now a slow grinding machine working in our favor. Arthur Dean was in custody, his confession and the mountain of crayon and charcoal evidence making a trial a grim formality. Harding called once a week, his voice losing its exhausted edge each time. He wasn't just a detective anymore. He was a co-conspirator in our survival, the first person outside our broken little circle who had chosen to listen. The day I had the window replaced was the true turning point. I stood in Alara's doorway and watched the glazier carefully cut the cracked pane from its frame. The sound of the glass groaning, then snapping free, was like a final satisfying exhale. He lifted the wounded square out, a jagged shard of our history, and replaced it with a single perfect sheet of new glass. The morning light poured in, unobstructed and clean. When he was gone, I took down the heavy curtains. I wanted the sun to flood every corner of that room. I wanted there to be no shadows left for monsters to hide in. Alara had watched the whole process from the hallway, her small face unreadable. That afternoon, I found a new box of crayons, a huge set with 100 different colors, and left it on her little wooden desk. The old, worn-down nubs had been taken as evidence, and I was glad to see them go. They were his tools, not hers. For a week, the new box sat untouched. The silence in the house was different now, lighter. It was just quiet, not listening. Then, one Saturday, I heard it again, the soft, familiar scrape of wax on paper. My heart gave a single, painful lurch of fear before I calmed myself. I walked to her room and stood at the door, peering in. Alara was at her desk, her shoulders still small, but not hunched. Her hand moved with a new rhythm, not the frantic, repetitive motion of before, but a slower, more thoughtful one. I held my breath, bracing myself to see the brown outline of a window, the black slash of a crack. But the paper was a riot of color. She was using a brilliant canary yellow, a color I hadn't seen her touch in a year. She was drawing a sun. It was huge and messy, its rays shooting out to every edge of the page. And in the corner, small but distinct, she had drawn two figures, one taller, one smaller. They were holding hands. Her testimony was no longer a warning. It was a statement. We are here. We are together. And the sun is coming out. A year has passed. The trial is a closed file, a man's name locked away with the rusted metal box that haunted our lives. The house is quiet, but it's a gentle, settled quiet now, the kind that lets you hear the birds in the morning. The stack of 100 drawings, our grim dossier, sits in an evidence locker. Their purpose served. They are no longer our story. I found Alara's new story last Tuesday. I was in the kitchen when I heard the distinct sound of tape being pulled from a dispenser. I walked to her room and stood in the doorway, my heart held in a state of suspended hope. She was on the floor, the big roll of paper Anya had given her spread out like a path. She wasn't drawing a single image. She was creating a sequence, a timeline, taping sheets of paper together. The first panel was the window, the shaky brown lines, the black crack. My breath caught, a familiar ghost of fear, but then I saw the next panel. A small figure with my long brown hair was standing in front of a man in a blue uniform, Harding. He was pointing toward the window. The third panel was the control booth, but this time the door was open and the man with the thinning hair was gone. The final, largest panel was a house. Our house. The window had no crack. The sun, a furious, brilliant yellow, filled the sky above it. And on the lawn, she had drawn two figures, me and her. And for the first time, she had drawn our faces. We were smiling. I sank to my knees in the hallway, tears blurring the image. He had forced a narrative on her, a single looping scene of terror. And here, on her own terms, she had broken the loop. She had drawn her way out. She had taken the weapon he had put in her hand and reshaped it into a key, unlocking her own story, giving it a beginning, a middle, and most importantly, an end. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was the author. She looked up then and saw me. She didn't flinch. She simply pointed to the last drawing, the one of us under the sun, and then pointed to herself and then to me. A quiet statement of fact. This is us now. I've learned that a voice is not just sound. It's insistence. It's color and line and the courage to pick up a crayon after the world has tried to weaponize it against you. The fight wasn't just to make people listen to her drawings. It was to give her the safety to draw her own future. Her voice was always there, a language written in wax, waiting for someone to learn how to read it. Stories like Alara's are everywhere, whispered in languages we don't always understand. If you believe they deserve to be heard and you want to help us find more of them, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening.